One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is something you alluded to, that the details of this agreement, the loss and damage agreement, are still to be worked out. And of course, many of those details are very tricky. I'm sure you're used to that. There's things like, who are the countries who are going to pay? Who are the countries that actually would receive assistance? Who would oversee that fund? And I'm going to ask you about U.S. taxpayer dollars next, but can you just give us a bit of a timeline and a bit of an idea of how you alluded to this is going to play out over the next year? How tricky is that, and how does that happen?
Well, it's very tricky. It's very complicated. There aren't many legislatures in the world that are prepared to put up public money in the sums that we need. And I believe that there's no government in the world, none whatsoever, that has the kind of money necessary to effect this transition at the pace we have to do it. The UN finance report estimates that there's about a $2.5 to $4.5 trillion per year deficit between now and 2050 in order to achieve the 1.5 degree limitation of warming. Right. So if the public sector doesn't have the money, who does? There's only one place. It's in the private sector. And in the lead up to Glasgow, many of us worked very hard to bring major financial institutions of the world into the game to pledge what they would be willing, for instance, to invest, not to give away, but to invest in this endeavor. So I went to the 6 biggest banks in America, and they sharpened their pencils, they did their homework, and about a month later, after the request, they came out and said, we are prepared, each with their own number, to invest between now and 2030, $4.16 trillion. That's a lot, that's serious money. But it's not going to deploy unless you have bankable deals. So how do you get the bankable deals? Well, for that, we have many different approaches that we're trying to bring together in sort of a blended finance approach. And one of those approaches is to get the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to be able to have larger drawing rights for the IMF, or be able, in the banks themselves, to be able to put more concessionary funding on the table so you could blend your finance and de-risk the deals. If you could de-risk, if you could have somebody else in line for taking the risk off initially, many of those entities, whether it's a BlackRock or Standard Bank or whoever it is, could step up and say, we're willing to invest at this point in time. That's what we did, Sally, actually, we did it with Egypt and we did it with Indonesia. And a big announcement was made at the G20 by President Widodo and President Biden and the EU that we were going to work with Indonesia, which has significantly increased its NDC, its committed level of reduction. They have taken it from about 23% up to 43% reduction by 2030. That would meet the standard of trying to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And they've doubled the amount of money up to about 30 gigawatts of renewables that they've pledged to deploy. And we're going to try to help them deploy. That's where the private sector comes in. So if we can, in the case of Indonesia, we have cobbled together about $10 billion of public money, which will be added to by leveraged, another about $9.5 billion of leveraged money. And together, that amount of money will help to facilitate the deployment of those renewables and the shutting of coal-fired power plants. That has to happen on a vastly broader scale than we are able to do it now. We can't run around and do one bespoke deal here, another bespoke deal there. It just isn't going to be fast enough. And so everything has to accelerate and by vast amounts. We have to be deploying renewables 6 times faster than we are today. We have to be deploying electric vehicles about 20 times faster than we are today, if you're going to keep the Earth's temperature at 1.5 degrees of increase. Now, why is that important? Because every 1/10 of a degree above the 1.5 takes you into what scientists will say is really dangerous, uncharted territory, which is far more expensive to cope with. So you want, and every analysis, economic, of this challenge makes it very clear it is far less expensive to be investing now, get ahead of it, than it is to wait when you will pay untold trillions of dollars and economies will be. If you think supply chains were interrupted by COVID, wait till you see what happens when 100 million people are moving in Africa because they can't live there anymore, they can't produce food, there's not enough water, and it's too hot. And we're already seeing indicators of that in various parts of the world.